and that's with Social Security. We have a lot of people. You see that immediately when you see people that are 200 years old that are being sent checks for Social Security. Some of them are actually being sent checks.
At 5:40 a.m., while most of Bloomington was still asleep, the operation began. Federal vehicles cut their engines outside a healthcare office. Doors opened in silence, and agents moved fast. No warnings, no negotiations. A search warrant was already in hand. Within minutes, boxes of files were carried out, hard drives were seized, and an ordinary-looking building was turned into an active federal crime scene. This was not a routine inspection. Investigators were hunting records tied to more than $1.1 million in Medicaid claims that, according to federal findings reported by Reuters and the Associated Press, showed signs of services that were billed but never fully provided. The action was deliberate and precise, suggesting the raid was not the beginning, but the final step of a long watch. What pushed federal agencies to move was not noise, but patterns. Billing numbers that jumped too fast, approvals that moved too smoothly, oversight that failed to slow anything down. Behind the paperwork, investigators believe they were looking at a system quietly draining public funds while no one hit the brakes. The warning now coming from Washington is far larger than this single raid. Federal officials say red flags across Minnesota's Medicaid system point to potential losses approaching $9 billion spread across multiple programs and years of unchecked activity. Political networks tied to allies of major state figures have entered the spotlight not as charges, but as part of a system that kept moving, even as alarms began to flash. If this were only one company, federal boots would not have hit the ground like this. They moved as if facing something bigger. Subscribe to Military Power to follow what comes next, because as this investigation expands, the real scope of what federal agencies are confronting is only beginning to surface. Minnesota sits at the center of this story because it runs one of the largest Medicaid systems in the Midwest, moving billions of dollars every year through programs designed to support the elderly, the disabled, and low-income families. On paper, the system looks solid. Funding is approved, services are logged, and oversight rules exist at every level. Yet according to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, that surface stability hit a deeper problem that had been quietly growing for years. Starting around 2018, federal and state auditors began noticing a strange shift. The number of Medicaid service providers across Minnesota increased sharply, and approval times moved faster instead of slowing under heavier demand. Small organizations, some with only a handful of staff, were suddenly billing millions of dollars in care services. Revenue climbed at speeds normally seen in fast-growing tech startups, not in regulated public health programs, yet those numbers kept clearing the system. What made the pattern more troubling was how little matched reality on the ground. Investigators later found that many providers lacked the personnel needed to deliver the volume of care they claimed. In several cases cited by Reuters, companies reported round-the-clock assistance for clients, while records and site checks showed minimal daily contact. The system accepted the paperwork, paid the claims, and moved on. Oversight existed, but it lived mostly inside forms and databases rather than in physical verification. As the money flowed, warning signs stacked up. Billing growth exploded without matching increases in staffing or equipment. Compliance issues were flagged but not resolved. Approvals were renewed quickly, even as claims rose far beyond earlier limits. According to the Associated Press, this was not limited to one corner of the state. Multiple programs showed similar behavior, suggesting the problem was structural rather than accidental. Federal agencies did not rush in. Instead, they watched. Investigators tracked data across years, compared claims against real-world activity, and waited for something they could not ignore. That moment arrived when a Medicaid recipient died, despite records showing they received extensive daily care. The gap between what was billed and what happened in reality was too large to explain away. It turned suspicion into certainty. By the time federal agents prepared their first raids, this was no longer about correcting paperwork. Prosecutors were already estimating potential exposure approaching $9 billion across high-risk Medicaid programs, a figure reported by Reuters based on internal federal assessments. The scale changed everything. This was not a single bad actor exploiting a loophole. It was a system that allowed exploitation to grow quietly until it became impossible to hide. That is why the response came with patience and precision. Federal agencies did not strike at the first red flag. They let the pattern repeat, the numbers grow, and the paper trail thicken. When they finally moved, it was with the confidence of investigators who already knew what they were walking into. The raid in Bloomington was not the opening shot. It was the moment the trap closed, triggered by a mistake too visible for any system to absorb. And as this story moves forward, one reality becomes clear. The federal government was not chasing noise. It was waiting for proof that could not be argued away, knowing that once exposed, the consequences would stretch far beyond a single company or a single state. March became the turning point, not because of a press conference or a leaked document, but because someone quietly died. A Medicaid recipient passed away that month, and at first, the case looked unremarkable. Deaths among vulnerable patients are sadly not rare. What made this one different was what appeared on the screen when investigators pulled the billing records. According to official files, the individual had been receiving 12 hours of personal care every single day, a level of support that suggested constant supervision and hands-on assistance. On paper, the care was intensive. In reality, it barely existed. When investigators reviewed logs, schedules, and visit records, a different picture emerged. Instead of round-the-clock attention, the patient had reportedly been checked once per day, briefly, with no evidence of the sustained care that Medicaid had been charged for. This gap between documentation and reality was not small or technical. It was stark. It meant that, for months, public money had flowed based on a story that did not match real life. Reporting by Reuters later confirmed that this death became a catalyst for federal action because it exposed something far more serious than a billing error. The system had accepted claims that described a level of care that investigators could not find any proof of. Forms were complete, codes were entered correctly, and payments went out on time. Yet the care itself was missing. The paperwork was alive. The service was not. That moment changed the tone of the investigation. What had been a quiet review of numbers and patterns turned into a hunt for scale. Federal agencies no longer focused on a single provider or a single set of claims. They began pulling data across programs, across counties, and across years. The question was no longer who made a mistake, but how many similar cases were hidden behind clean-looking files. As the scope widened, investigators saw the same structure repeating. Records showing long daily care sessions matched against minimal staffing and limited visits. Billing histories that suggested constant activity paired with thin evidence on the ground. According to the Associated Press, this pattern appeared in multiple Medicaid programs, not just one service category. The death had revealed the system's weakest point. It trusted documentation more than reality. Federal officials did not announce this shift publicly. Instead, they let the data speak. Claims were compared against staffing rosters. Visit times were cross-checked with travel distances. Payment growth was measured against actual capacity. What they found suggested that the deceased recipient was not an exception. The case simply made the imbalance impossible to ignore. From Washington's perspective, this was the moment the investigation crossed a line. Medicaid fraud is serious on its own, but when false claims intersect with patient safety, it becomes something else entirely. A system designed to protect vulnerable people had allowed money to move without ensuring care followed. That realization pushed federal agencies to expand their focus beyond individual companies and into the structure that allowed these claims to survive review. By late spring, investigators were no longer asking whether fraud existed. They were asking how deep it ran. Internal estimates, later cited by Reuters, warned that high-risk Medicaid programs across Minnesota involved billions of dollars in spending that required closer scrutiny. The death in March was not the cause of the problem, it was the proof. And that proof raised a question federal investigators could not avoid. If one person's care existed only on paper, how many other records were still breathing inside the system while the people behind them were left unseen? As the investigation moved beyond individual cases, federal analysts turned to the one place that never lies quietly: statewide payment data. What they saw immediately changed the scale of the story. Line by line, year by year, Medicaid billing totals across Minnesota revealed a surge that did not behave like normal growth. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, one major community care program expanded from about $4.6 million in 2021 to more than $170 million by 2024. That jump was not gradual, it was explosive. In a regulated welfare system, growth usually triggers friction. More claims should mean more questions, more inspections, and slower approvals. Instead, investigators found the opposite. As the money accelerated, the approval process appeared to move faster. Claims sailed through with minimal resistance, even as totals multiplied far beyond previous years. To experienced federal auditors, this pattern stood out immediately. It looked less like organic demand and more like a pipeline opening wide. Digging deeper, investigators compared billing data with what could be verified in the real world. Many claimed services lacked on-site confirmation. There were no time-stamped visit logs, no independent checks, and no clear proof that work had been completed as described. In some cases, providers billed for intensive daily care across dozens of clients while operating with staffing levels that made such service physically impossible. The paperwork was complete. The reality was not. Reuters later reported that these discrepancies were not isolated. They appeared across multiple programs and providers, often repeating the same structure. High-volume claims, limited personnel, and thin documentation. The system trusted numbers more than presence. Once a provider was approved, claims flowed with little resistance unless someone actively challenged them. What raised even more concern was how quickly money moved once approvals were granted. Payments arrived on predictable schedules, creating steady cash flow that rewarded speed and volume. For investigators, this shifted the focus from total dollars to velocity. Fraud on a small scale drains funds slowly. Organized exploitation moves fast because speed reduces scrutiny and increases payoff before alarms sound. Federal officials describe abnormal growth as a classic early warning sign of organized fraud, a point echoed in multiple investigative reports cited by the Associated Press. Legitimate care programs rarely grow by thousands of percent in a short window. When they do, safeguards normally tighten. In Minnesota's case, safeguards appeared to loosen. This realization reframed the investigation. It was no longer just about inflated claims. It was about how the system itself responded to risk. Instead of slowing down under pressure, it sped up. That behavior allowed questionable providers to expand rapidly, drawing in millions before meaningful oversight could catch up. Behind the scenes, federal teams began mapping how approvals, payments, and renewals interacted. They tracked how long it took for money to move from request to payout. What emerged was a system optimized for efficiency, not verification. That efficiency became a vulnerability. By this stage, investigators understood they were not chasing random abuse. They were watching a financial stream that had been redirected. The dramatic rise from millions to hundreds of millions was not simply about need. It reflected a process that could be exploited repeatedly across programs without triggering an immediate shutdown. This was no longer just about how much money was lost. It was about how quickly it moved, how easily it passed through checkpoints, and how long it took before anyone stopped it. The real danger was not the total sum alone. It was the speed of the flow. and how many hands could reach into it before the system finally noticed something was wrong. As billing numbers grew and individual cases stacked up, investigators began to notice something that could not be explained by coincidence. When federal teams lined up company records side by side, patterns emerged that felt less like independent businesses and more like coordinated movement. Different providers appeared separate on paper, yet they shared the same office addresses, the same phone numbers, and sometimes even the same email domains. What looked like competition from the outside started to resemble duplication. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, this overlap raised immediate alarms inside federal agencies. Legitimate care organizations usually guard their infrastructure closely. Shared contact details suggested something else was happening, especially when those organizations were billing millions at the same time. Investigators dug deeper and found staff moving between companies with unusual speed. Managers appeared on multiple payrolls. Compliance officers rotated roles. Titles changed, but the faces stayed familiar. Slowly, a network began to take shape. Federal analysts mapped ownership filings, licensing documents, and staffing records, connecting each dot until a broader structure emerged. This was not one bad provider copying another's paperwork. It was a web of linked entities designed to look separate while operating in parallel. Each company filed its own claims, each passed through the same approval system, and each drew money from the same pool. As the map expanded, another detail stood out. Some of the most aggressive operators were not from Minnesota at all. Investigators identified individuals who had arrived from other states, set up shop quickly, and plugged directly into local Medicaid programs. According to Associated Press reporting, these operators appeared to target regions where oversight lagged behind growth. They did not build slowly. They scaled fast, pushing claims before regulators had time to react. Inside federal briefings, this tactic had a name. Investigators called it fraud tourism, a short phrase that captured a troubling strategy. Operators moved towards systems with weaker controls, exploited them at speed, and extracted money before safeguards tightened. It was efficient, portable, and difficult to stop once in motion. Minnesota, with its rapid program expansion and approval bottlenecks, became an attractive target. The danger of this structure was not just financial. Networks spread risk across multiple entities, making enforcement harder. When one provider faced scrutiny, others kept billing. When one license was questioned, another remained active. The system was being played not through force, but through design. Everything looked legal at first glance. Everything passed initial checks. Reuters later reported that federal investigators viewed these overlaps as evidence of coordination rather than negligence. The same patterns appeared again and again. Shared infrastructure, interlocking staff, rapid formation followed by explosive billing. Each element on its own could be explained away. Together, they told a different story. At this stage, the investigation stopped being reactive. Federal agencies shifted to proactive tracking, watching how new providers entered the system, how quickly they began billing, and whether they mirrored existing networks. The goal was no longer to catch mistakes, but to expose architecture. Who built it? Who benefited from it? And who looked the other way as it grew? From the outside, Medicaid fraud can seem abstract, buried in spreadsheets and audits. From the inside, investigators saw something far more deliberate, a system that allowed linked organizations to operate side by side, draining funds while appearing compliant. The question was no longer whether abuse occurred. It was how long it had been allowed to scale. Networks do not grow in isolation. They survive because oversight fails to connect the dots fast enough. And that left federal officials facing a question with no easy answer. Who allowed this structure to exist for so long without pulling it apart? As the investigation widened, the spotlight began to drift toward an area federal agencies usually approach with caution: the political environment surrounding the system. Investigators were clear about one thing from the start. This was not a criminal case against elected officials. No charges were filed against politicians, and no indictments named them as defendants. Yet as federal teams followed money, approvals, and oversight failures, political connections kept appearing at the edges of the picture. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, several organizations under scrutiny had ties to political allies or supporters linked to high-profile Minnesota figures, including Ilhan Omar and Tim Walz. These references were not presented as accusations. Instead, they highlighted proximity. The question was not who broke the law, but how influence, access, and weak oversight overlapped inside a system moving billions of dollars. Federal investigators framed the issue carefully. In public briefings, they emphasized that political relationships alone do not equal wrongdoing. What mattered was the environment those relationships existed in. Oversight agencies had the authority to slow approvals, demand verification, and suspend payments when risks increased. In multiple cases, that authority was not used. Programs expanded rapidly, providers multiplied, billing surged, yet meaningful checks lagged behind. This is where the investigation shifted tone. What began as a financial review now raised governance questions. Who was responsible for ensuring safeguards kept pace with growth? Who noticed the warning signs? And who had the power to act when they appeared? According to Associated Press reporting, federal officials became increasingly concerned that oversight failures were not isolated mistakes, but symptoms of a system that prioritized speed and expansion over control. Behind closed doors, federal agencies discuss the implications openly. Medicaid is not just a social program, it is one of the largest public spending mechanisms in the United States. When fraud or abuse reaches scale, it threatens trust in the system itself. Officials warned that unchecked exploitation does more than waste money. It undermines confidence in government programs designed to protect vulnerable populations. That concern explains why political context mattered, even without criminal allegations. When organizations linked to political networks operate inside weak oversight environments, accountability becomes blurred. Regulators may hesitate, reviews may slow. Pressure, even unspoken, can shape how aggressively rules are enforced. Investigators did not need proof of interference to recognize the risk. Reuters reported that federal prosecutors increasingly described the case as a systemic failure rather than a collection of bad actors. The language shifted from healthcare fraud to financial security. Large-scale misuse of public funds, especially when enabled by regulatory gaps, was treated as a broader threat. In internal assessments, officials warned that billions of dollars moving through poorly monitored programs create opportunities not just for fraud, but for organized exploitation. This marked a turning point in how the case was understood. It was no longer confined to medical services or billing codes. It touched on how power, oversight, and responsibility interact when massive funding streams are involved. Federal agencies began sending a clear message through their actions. Failure to control a system at scale carries consequences regardless of intent. By the end of this phase, one conclusion had settled in Washington. This was no longer just a healthcare fraud investigation. It was a warning about what happens when financial safeguards fall behind political and administrative reality. The stakes were no longer measured only in dollars lost, but in the integrity of the system itself. As federal agencies tighten their grip, one message is now unmistakable. This investigation is not slowing down. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, federal prosecutors estimate that 14 high-risk Medicaid programs are under review, involving nearly $18 billion in total funding, with roughly half showing indicators of potential fraud or abuse. Those numbers alone explain why Washington is not treating this as a closed chapter. Minnesota became the focal point, but officials have made clear it may not be the final stop. The same warning signs seen here exist wherever massive public funds move faster than oversight can follow. Investigators are still tracing networks, comparing data, and reviewing approvals that slipped through unchecked. Every new record pulled raises the possibility that similar structures are operating elsewhere, quietly embedded in systems built on trust. From the U.S. perspective, the goal is not to weaken Medicaid or punish those who rely on it. Federal officials have repeatedly stressed that this effort is about protecting the system, not dismantling it. When exploitation reaches scale, it drains resources meant for the most vulnerable and erodes confidence in public programs. That is why this response has been firm, methodical, and far from finished. What makes this case unsettling is not only the money involved, but the simplicity of how it moved. Paperwork passed, payments flowed, oversight lagged, and it continued until patterns became impossible to ignore. If you want to stay with us as federal agencies press forward and more layers are pulled back, like and subscribe to Military Power, and share your thoughts in the comments on what this case says about the systems meant to protect public funds.